All right, so now that we are all here, we'll call the meeting to order. Ms. Goodell, would you please call the roll?
Yes, Mr. Anderson?
Here.
Mr. Castillo? Ms. Gill?
Here.
Ms. Litton?
Here.
Mr. Reitinger?
Here.
Ms. Russell?
Here.
And Mr. Webb?
Here.
Thank you.
Would you all please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would someone please move to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Castillo. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstained. Next is our, move on to the work session, section 2.01, our superintendent's evaluation structure process, and I will hand this over to Mr. Anderson.
So this is, I think, going to be a fairly short little summary of things. Just want to make sure everybody's had a chance to think about the timeline. So we are here at our work session to talk about the timeline for Dr. Noonan's evaluation for the year, reminding everybody that our policy and state code and also other things require an annual review. Our last evaluation was in July of last year, so we've got one by early July this year. So the timeline suggesting is that at our meeting on the 14th, that Dr. Noonan could present us presentation of progress toward the goals that we adopted back in November. And then by the end of May, I would like to ask for members to send me written comments on the evaluation, using the evaluation instrument that we approved a while ago, so that I can try to bring this together into a draft consensus document that I would send to the board about a week later, prior to our meeting in early June on the 11th. And then on the 11th of June, we'd have a closed session to finalize our consensus evaluation and make sure that we've got the evaluation looking the way that we want it to be, and then send this by the end of that week to Dr. Noonan. So you've got a few days, Dr. Noonan, before that, before the discussion on the 18th. That would be in a closed session to go over the evaluation there, and so that would get us done in time to be meeting our yearly standard. If we need more time, we actually can go as late as the July 9th meeting and still be on time with the requirements of everything. So that's kind of the schedule in a nutshell. And I don't know if anybody has comments or questions. Okay. Thanks. Yes, sir.
The self-evaluation piece, did you want to ask?
Yeah,
Consensus of the board, or?
Yeah, why don't we get a sense of that? That's right. So our evaluation instrument for Dr. Noonan includes both a section that the board prepares and also a self-evaluation, written self-evaluation form. My understanding, Dr. Noonan, is that some of the other superintendents also do similar written, but not necessarily using that form, just some sort of a memo to help evaluate progress as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so the question is, would we like to ask Dr. Noonan for that? And if so, I'd like to suggest that we make that way past the 14th of May, make that towards the end of May, beginning of June, to give enough time for Dr. Noonan to put that together in timing with other things that are on his plate. How do people feel about that? I've got thumbs up, but
Mr. Castillo?
Just a question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Is the superintendent inclined to do this? Does the superintendent believe this is useful, or is this?
I think it serves a different purpose than the presentation that I would be doing at the May 14th presentation. So the May 14th presentation really talks about sort of the three big goals that we adopted, the two instructional goals and the operating goals. What the self-evaluation form does is it goes through each of the standards, mission and vision, planning and assessment, instructional leadership, organizational leadership and safety, communication, community relations, and professionalism, and then division-wide student academic progress, and asks me to identify within each of those standards what I see as areas of strength, and then areas needing work and strategies for improvement to improve performance. So I think it gives you two different pieces of information. The self-evaluation is probably more aligned to the actual evaluation instrument that you'll be using than the presentation that I would be doing on the 14th. So I think to help support you in being able to see the linkage between the work that I'm doing and the superintendent's evaluation, it probably would be a useful instrument to have. So if you were crosswalking planning and assessment, what does that standard look like? What does he see as his strengths? And then where are some areas of improvement? Because those pieces might not be picked up in the May 14th presentation in a way that would be really clear, if that makes sense. So in the abstract, I'm not opposed to it. It's a workflow issue, and we'll sort it out.
All right, if there are no further questions or comments, yes, Mr. Anderson.
So, just asking for a sense on that question. It seems like I'm seeing thumbs up and nods and that kind of thing. So the last thing, and I'll just bring this forward for thought, but to have there is thinking about future years, the evaluation process, and this is a somewhat discussion of the goals in the triennial plan and the evaluation instrument, making them more closely aligned to each other while also adhering to the 7 standards that VDOE requires for superintendent evaluation. So if we can think about a way to make our evaluation instrument align more completely with the superintendent's goals with the triennial plan and still be able to do that, I think that's something we on the board should tackle this summer. And the only other question is timing for future evaluations too. There are data that are available from the state, but they don't come available until late enough in the summer that our current evaluation process misses them. And so it may be useful to have some of that information for some of the results, particularly on things like SOLs and that sort of thing. But doing that would necessarily require us to shift things a little later. That's not a conversation we have to decide tonight. It's just a point for people to think about, and we can talk about this some more later. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. We'll move on to 2.02, discussion of policy KQ.
All right, so I'm going to actually turn it over to Tricia Minson here in just a second. This is becoming what is it? An enigma wrapped in a riddle, surrounded by anyway. It is becoming more complex by the day, and part of the reason that it's becoming more complex by the day is that every time we think we've sort of got it, another sort of nuanced piece around fundraising or sponsorship and partnership comes up. And so today, as an example, I had an opportunity to meet with the SAOs for about 2.5 hours. And part of the conversation that we had together was to sort of talk about KQ. And our SAOs are incredibly attuned to the work that they're doing and do really tremendous things on behalf of the school system. And very instantly, we're sort of able to poke holes in sort of the conversation and questions that we were raising with respect to KQ. So what does this mean for, if we do a pizza night at a local pizza establishment and 10% of the proceeds goes to the SAO? Do we need to get, approval for that in advance? And some things like that just sort of came up. So we continue, Tricia and I, we being Tricia and I, continue to sort of refine this policy to make sure that it works for you and that you maintain the control over the schools, which is your responsibility. And at the same time, works for us as a staff and then works for the SAOs as well. Because the one thing I think all of us would agree, and we've said this before, is we don't want to put in a policy that becomes so cumbersome that those people that really want to support the schools can't support the schools. So with that in mind, this continues to be a work in progress. I don't see it ending right away. I do think it's going to be a continued conversation. After tonight, we'll take your thoughts and your edits back. We'll re-machinate over it and then bring you the next iteration of that. So with that sort of setup, I'll turn it over to Tricia Minson.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Noonan. So we did discuss KQ for the first time for first reading in March. We did a work session in March where you gave a lot of great feedback on what you wanted to look like We did second reading without adoption at our last meeting. And so the iteration that's on board docs now and that's in front of you is changes in red, strike-throughs from the April 9th second reading. There are some minor word tweaks. You'll see that on page 1. There was a discussion of whether we needed the whole last sentence in the first paragraph, and it was determined that rather than saying the school board expects continued funding, we could add ongoing to the sentence before and remove that sentence. So that is in that is reflected here, as that was the consensus of the board. I did, reading through it again this evening, realize I'm missing the word city on line 38 of the first page, so I'm going to add that back in. I'll put that in red line for when it's presented for third reading at the next meeting. There were a few more tweaks on page 2, consistent with feedback from the board. The one that I wanted to point out for discussion tonight to see if this reflects the will of the board is a sponsorship review committee. There was a good, healthy discussion about what that group would look like, that it would be a one-year appointment. And so we've tweaked that sentence at line 35, stating that the sponsorship review committee will be appointed for an annual term and will be guided by the superintendent. I think that reflects what folks were leaning towards at the last meeting.
Can I, just for a second, that word guided is open for negotiation. We actually.
Thesaurusized it.
We thesaurusized it. We had 4 different options in there, and guided was sort of where we landed. The idea being that, and maybe it's a chair, maybe it's whatever you think is probably right, but I want to, whatever it is, I want to make sure that the superintendent isn't in a position of undue influence with that committee, because I think it really needs to be the committee's work. So if guided is the right word, perhaps that's the best to do it. We had said shepherded at one point, and we're not sure that really worked.
Okay. The next major change that was discussed at second reading is on page 4. That was the morals provision, and I got feedback from Mr. Castillo. Thank you. You sent me actually a very good morals clause that I was able to tweak a little bit. And Ms. Michael, thank you. You also ended up sending me the same article that Mr. Castillo did, and I thought it was really good. The language that's in there now at lines 14 to 22. I added that the school board can, upon written notice to the sponsor, either suspend the agreement or terminate the agreement if one of 3 things occur. And all are based on a credible allegation that the sponsor or partner engaged in something, rather than waiting for a criminal charge to be filed or waiting for a court plea. So if there's a published credible allegation that the sponsor has committed an act of moral turpitude, or committed a felony under state or federal law, or failed to act with due regard for social conventions, public morals, and decency, then, upon written notice, the agreement can either be suspended or terminated in the sole discretion of the board. In those instances, the board also has the right to remove the sponsor's name from any places that it exists, and that would be written into any agreement that the board enters into with the sponsor or with the partner, so they would know at the time of the donation that if something happens down the line and their name is on a brick, that brick can be removed if they are found, if there's been a published credible allegation that individual has been engaged in a felony or has acted in a way that is without due regard to social conventions. And that does leave it open to the board to determine, is this something that we want to act on at this point, or is this something we'd want to suspend the agreement pending the outcome of a criminal investigation? But it does give the board the authority to make a decision in the future of how it wants to treat a named either acknowledgement or project or a name of the sponsor that would be present on one of our buildings or in one of our facilities. How are you all feeling about that as a morals clause that has a little bit more teeth to it, leaves the board with discretion, but as I think really any morals clause would be, is a bit open-ended, so would be incumbent upon a future board, depending upon what the circumstance is, to look at what's occurred or what's alleged to have occurred and make a decision of do we suspend the agreement, do we terminate the agreement, do we remove the naming, do we cover up the naming until we get to the bottom of what the facts are? How are folks feeling about this?
Mr. Redinger?
So I'm fine with 1, I'm
Okay.
fine with 2, and I'm troubled by 3.
Okay.
I would be much happier to add, if some additional language were added that I don't think would make a difference in any case where we wanted to act. Something along the lines of that adversely affects the educational environment.
And Dr. Noonan had said, and I didn't move it over when we met to talk about this, adding in light of the relationship with the school division, or something that says it relates to education. So whatever the standards of social convention and public morals are in relation to the schools.
I'd want it stronger than in relation to the schools. I mean, I actually would want something that says that adversely affects the educational environment, or a similar piece of language before I was comfortable with anything talking about social conventions.
We do on paragraph 2 of the written agreement, so at line 6 of page 3, it says a statement that the board has the right to terminate the agreement without penalty if it determines that the agreement is having an adverse impact on the educational experience of students, including without limitation if developments occur such that the sponsorship or partnership involves one or more of the prohibitions below. So I don't think that that would necessarily need to be restated. I think 3 then could come out if that's the will of the board.
If the language of 3 stays in there, I want that same piece of language down in there, or I am in trouble with that.
How do other folks feel?
Other comments?
I would just say I agree. I still don't feel comfortable with that, just because I feel like it could be interpreted so many different ways.
And I would echo their concerns. I have the same concerns with the language and the interpretation of what social conventions, public morals, or decency might mean to any board at any point in time. Mr. Anderson?
I agree with that. I also I have a general concern with the idea that upon the first publication of a creditable allegation that one of these things has happened, it seems like we're basically opening ourselves up to guilt by accusation. Just because something is published, sadly, we all know that's not necessarily accurate. And so I worry about what that might open potential problems. But I also have the same concern about social conventions, to some degree. Who defines it? I guess that's sort of one of those it's in the eye of the beholder kind of things, and that worries me.
As far, Mr. Anderson, as your point for a first publication of a credible allegation, I think that gives future boards flexibility to decide, do we want to suspend the agreement pending either investigation or pending a criminal case, or do we even need to take action right now? So the board would have to determine, do we think this is credible? Can we go to the sponsor and ask about it? Can we find out information on our own? I don't think a board's going to hire a private investigator, but if it's picked up at a news publication, is it widely disseminated? Are there criminal charges pending? What is the response of the sponsor, the partner? The board doesn't have to take action, but this would allow the board to step in if it, not knowing what the act of moral turpitude or the felony is. I think it gives the board the authority to step in if it wants to, but it doesn't require that the board do anything at that particular time.
Mr. Castillo?
Yeah, I'd just say that 3 is a catch-all. It doesn't require anything. And I would say, you know, there are a lot of things that appear on YouTube or other social media that don't fall into 1 or 2. But if one of our donors did them, we might want to have the right, which we might not want to exercise, to distance ourselves from that person. And I think with respect to an adverse effect on education, that's a pretty narrow standard, because you know, there are a lot of things, again, where I think they could be highly negative and things that we wouldn't want to be associated with that would not have an adverse impact on education. So, you know, I think just because you have this tool in the toolbox doesn't mean that you would use it. It would be situational. So I think that's something to think about, because a lot of these difficulties are ones that you look at them and you think, you know, nobody could make this up, and yet they happen. So I think this isn't a hair trigger kind of provision. I think it's one that exists to provide us options where if we didn't have them, we would probably wish that we did. So.
Other comments? Mr. Reidinger?
I actually think the adversely affecting the educational environment's a little broader than Mr. Castillo does, but also I'm uncomfortable with the language without some additional restriction. I take Mr. Castillo's point, but I think it's too broad as written, and I would not vote for it.
Other, yes, Ms. Russell?
As to Mr. Castillo's point, having in a previous life worked in a capacity where I saw a lot of interesting situations and things that came up, I think that Mr. Castillo makes a very valid point that there are just a lot of things that happen that you just can't even imagine and would never imagine that something would come up like that you'd have to deal with. And I think that trying to think through every scenario, and I don't know, I just think it would be nice to have that escape clause in there.
So maybe we can try to roll up our sleeves and figure out something. I would think, could we do something that's not consistent with our mission? Something that's a little, obviously, there are a lot of things that you can do that, as unpleasant, unpalatable as they may be, I don't think they would be grounds for terminating something. So, inconsistent with our educational mission is one that, it forces us to provide some nexus, like it's more than, well, we just don't like the fact that somebody did something that's we're not aligned with. So I agree, it has to be, there has to be some nexus. I don't know if you want to go to cause and effect, but if it's kind of like, we're getting a little uncomfortable here with how this is trending. So I throw that out for everyone to chew on.
I think I can agree with everything Mr. Castillo just said. My question is, Ms. Minson, you read some language before. Where in the agreement is that?
That is on page 3, lines 6 through 10. And I have a proposal up once you all look through that of how to maybe.
So, the language that is already there is, if it determines that the agreement is having an adverse impact on the educational experience of students. So if that's the language that's already in there, I'd be much more comfortable if we just inserted that section and say, in part 3, that is having an adverse impact on the educational experience of students.
I think that's a good idea. One, perhaps tweak of that language would be to have Roman 3 say, as it does, fail to act with due regard to social conventions, public morals, and decency, and that the school board in its sole discretion determines would adversely impact the schools. So then we wouldn't have to wait for a student to come forward and say, this is impacting me. We could say, we clearly could see how this would offend students of this class, this race, this religion, without waiting for a complaint to come forward. So it allows the board in its sole discretion to look at this, say, we could see how this could impact this class of student, this type of student, and so we're going to act now. So then it's tied to the impact of the schools, but isn't waiting for a student to have to come forward as a victim or to feel belittled or put down by the fact that there's a relationship between the partner and the sponsor. Does that balance competing needs and ideas? I think you all are thinking of this the exact way that I'd hope, that this is the nitty-gritty that gets problematic if we don't think about it beforehand. So thanks for helping think through that. It looks like people are maybe okay with that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm trying to find a bridge between, I think, two very valid points. I'm just wondering about, is there something in one of our other policies that deals with the more general case of maybe not impacting specifically the educational environment, but being contrary to the mission or vision or something of the school division, that we could you could have both, I suppose. You could say impacting the educational experience or blah, if there's some language that we could pull in. I'm still a little uncomfortable with the publication thing, but I'm trying to figure out the other part right now.
As far as what's in our current policies, on page 5, it does say that no agreement shall be entered into if the sponsorship or partnership involves or gives the appearance of involving any activity which could result in the following. And then bullet number 3, discrimination prohibited by any law or school board policy. I think we have a broad anti-discrimination policy that would allow that to be wrapped up in this. And the fact that the agreement, one of the bullets of the agreement says that none of the following provisions of the policy will be violated. So that kind of catch-all comes back to the policies in that way. But we could add in this morals clause provision, would adversely impact the schools in light of the role of the board or of current policies and regulations.
Yeah, I think hooking in policies and regulations is not a bad way to go.
Can I'm just wondering, I think the hot button is public morals and decency. That would be my guess if I was reading the team right. So I do wonder if there's some way to say it with respect to, or fails to meet school division expectations as designated by the school board's mission statement and is disruptive to the educational process, or something sort of tying all of that together might be something to consider. So I wonder if we should take this back and take another shot and send it out for some smithing.
Yep, Mr. Right here.
I think that's a reasonable way to go, Dr. Noonan. I'd say you could substitute for clause 3, as I think you're suggesting, a different type of language that didn't refer to things like social conventions and decency, and simply said, or fails to act in a way fully in accord with the mission and vision, whatever, of the Falls Church City Public Schools. That sort of left open that made clear that it had to be something that actually adversely affected the schools, as opposed to something that offended somebody. And that's kind of the thing I want to get at. So if I think you could write that in a different way. It's the decency and social conventions and morals part of that really sets my hackles off.
And I think by referencing the school board mission policy and regulations, the school board could point directly to the portion of the mission or directly at the policy or the regulation that it feels has been violated, as opposed to saying, this is my social convention and this is why I think it's been violated. I think that.
I'm looking at the triennial plan, and I'm looking at our vision and mission, and then the bullets below the 5 big areas of focus and emphasis. So student-centered teaching and learning, excellent staff, optimal facilities and learning environments, fiscal management, community engagement. And as I look at that, I'm seeing things like ensuring equity of access. I'm seeing things like educating students in safe and secure environments. And it seems like we could tie a lot back to that if there was something that would have an impact, because the other truth of it is, to me anyway, is it seems like even something that we wouldn't necessarily plan for, sort of to your point, Mr. Castillo, is as technology and social media is now, it's going to have an impact on the school environment, sort of one way or another. I would suggest that there's going to be some disruption. Kids are going to be saying, did you see this or did you see that, or it's going to make its rounds. So, and then it becomes a question of is it disruptive to the learning environment? I would say that it would be. Just some.
Ms. Russell?
So could we put in there, and I don't know if this is too broad, but to say that it would be, I guess something along the lines of being contradictory, or somehow, I guess, going against any of our mission and vision and any current FCCPS policy. So that way it would, any policy that we have out there, and I think that we've probably, hopefully covered all of the things that are relevant to the educational environment and workplace environment, would be covered if we said, that's contradictory to any policy that we have. So that would, anything that's not in the mission and vision would also be included in the policies. So. And then one other small point, in line 1, I thought we'd agree to take small out and just have it be maintaining and inclusive, or is that just me who took it out? Was it just me? No, I Okay.
Okay. So removing small, page 1, line
Yeah,
1?
sorry, just want to throw that in there. So, yeah, so maintaining and inclusive rather than a small
Yes.
inclusive.
Got it. Sorry, I missed that. Thank
No
you.
small school divisions, just small people, right?
Great. Well, that helped a lot. Sorry.
Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of other items. One is, I think, I'm looking at page 2, lines 26 and 27.
Yes.
I think there are some copy and pasting things that are sort of funny, but I'm also wondering if maybe we didn't capture something I recall from our discussion at the last meeting. Partnership extends beyond, I think well, 1 or more school years and does not exceed $20,000 in value, but there was also some discussion of perhaps having a maximum duration. I don't know that we settled on that, and I don't know if this is reflecting really the true will of the board. I just remember that conversation piece, and so I'm asking what folks recall from that. But in any event, I don't think it should be 1 or more single school years.
1 or more school years.
Yes, that's the one I think is accurate, but I don't know, did we have a discussion about putting an upper limit on it? Yeah, but I don't remember.
But I don't
where
think we
ended
had landed on anything
Okay.
specifically,
But you can now.
I guess.
How do you feel about a duration of no more than 5 years?
up. I personally think we should have some kind of an upper limit just because it gets rid of a bunch of pathological things that could otherwise show up, stuff that you can imagine somebody trying to do something weird. But if 5 doesn't seem unworkable, I'm okay with it, but I don't know what others think.
I'm just thinking about school board terms, like if it, so that we don't do a 5-year and then it binds, there's a completely new board that is in, and then that's, the new board is in, and they're like, I'm just trying to think of like a weird situation. I don't know if 3 years is,
I only raised 5 because we had a conversation with the SAOs this morning, and they're doing some contractual, they're doing some sponsorships for 5. And it just seemed like maybe that would be the,
it's a nice,
yeah.
it's a nice
I'm
number.
not tied to it,
Yeah,
but
no,
I-
but so I was just trying to think of some other options, but.
And I guess one more thing, with regard to the committee, did we definitely agree on the committee serving for a year? Or I know we'd had some talk about looking at ad hoc, and so I wasn't sure if we'd landed on something, and I guess, I thought we had some really valid points about the value of a ad hoc committee in certain circumstances as well, so not to throw that at Tricia and add to the workload.
Yeah, that's fine.
This was the other point I was thinking about talking about too, which is the first 2 sentences of the next section, so lines 33 through 36 on the same page. Saying we may create a sponsorship review committee, and then in the next sentence saying shall be appointed for, I don't know if that's contradictory, but it read like that to me. I would just say my position is that there should be one, and it should not be on an ad hoc basis. It should be on an annual basis or something like that, because that would dissociate the committee from any particular application, and it would force us or future boards to think more broadly about who would be appropriate to have on such a committee, and then they could evaluate things in that way. So I guess I would argue, I wouldn't be comfortable with one that's an ad hoc committee myself. I'd argue for for a fixed term.
So would it be a standing committee then? So if it says shall create a sponsorship review committee, then it sounds like it's a standing committee and not created in response to something. Is that your picture?
Well, so that's actually the question I think I was trying to ask at the beginning, is it's saying we may create one implies we don't have to, but if we're saying the committee, it sort of sounds like we're saying this language as written could be read to say the board could create a committee. If it does, it's a year-long term guided by the superintendent.
That's how I read it.
But if it's not, if the
Yeah.
board chooses not to, then the rest of that doesn't matter because we don't have such a committee. So,
I mean, I guess my thought on this was that it would only be used sometimes. I mean, I feel like we don't want to make this so cumbersome that it's hard, that we're using it all the time and things aren't moving through as quickly as they need to. So I guess I was thinking of it more ad hoc. When there's something pretty big that comes up, then we form a committee to consider it. I mean, I guess my worry would be if you appoint a committee and then nothing ever arises, then they're kind of on a committee that never does anything.
And then we'd have to make a new committee every year because they're appointed for 1 year, so every year we'd have to constitute a new committee. If it's a standing committee.
I think it's an interesting question, simply because part of what our struggle is understanding the universe of fundraising across the division. Just as an example, today, I asked the question of the elementary PTA, how much do you make on a brick campaign? And they expect to make between $13,000 and $15,000 on bricks. Well, if we were to go to a middle school or a high school brick campaign, it's probably double that, which would then kick in. It would be over the 20,000, then we'd need to have a committee. So I think part of it is not understanding what the universe of all of the fundraising is. And so as a consequence of that, I don't know quite how to advise you on whether it would be ad hoc or standing, but it seems to me that perhaps having a committee for a year would be a good start. And if we didn't have any come through, perhaps we could change it back to ad hoc, or we could say standing or ad hoc, depending on the year.
Start with Mr. Webb.
And so I guess for me, I'm trying to understand kind of that whole piece, right, that you just talked about. How do we not have a full understanding of what those groups exactly do of fundraising? Has it just been because it's been the false church way of they do it, they give you, and we don't ask many questions because they're giving it to us? Or I guess I'm confused because there's a lot. You're right. There are a lot of different the PTAs, and they raise fairly decent, chunks of money for those things. But to kind of to hear, this is what the middle school folks would raise in a brick campaign, which you're right, probably would be double what, particularly with a new high school on the horizon, it probably would be double what that would be, and trying to figure out where to land of this policy, because that very quickly kind of goes right up at the edge of that $20,000 limit. And I do, with the committee, I do think there needs to be a committee in place. I think at least for the year. And then also for me, I think the 5-year kind of number for the sponsorships is kind of a good in the middle area there.
I can respond to that first piece if
The
you'd like.
first piece.
I think one of the things that we're discovering is that there have been some practices in place that haven't always followed the policy as written. And our current policy does indicate that folks are supposed to develop a fundraising plan, vet it with the school board, and then proceed to their fundraising. And so we actually had this conversation this morning because some of the SAOs asked the same question. Well, we've just been doing it, and they've been, again, doing a great job for us. We're understanding now that perhaps the policy hasn't always been followed to the letter of the policy.
So not to add a whole new layer here, but so we're talking about, when I read this, I read sponsorship of, and then there's certain dollar values. So for instance, in the brick campaign situation, we're not talking about one person giving $20,000 or even two people giving $10,000 each. We're talking about 100 people giving X amount each. And so I'm just wondering if that language needs to be finely tuned, that we need to differentiate in terms of what we mean by sponsorship. Because when I think of sponsorship, I think of a lump sum by one individual or entity. I don't see the committee vetting 150 people who've donated to a brick campaign to make sure that all of them meet this criteria. Obviously, if somebody were to come forward and have information that someone was a convicted sex offender who donated to the brick campaign, we might want to pull that, but I just don't see us going through line by line to make sure that nobody, that everybody meets this criteria. So I'm just curious if the policy needs to differentiate in terms of what sponsorship means.
As it's written now, the idea would be a PTA or an SAO comes to the school board and says, we'd like to do a brick campaign. We anticipate it would raise $25,000 with each brick. Families will buy it for X amount of dollars and be allowed 3 lines that have this number of characters. And we would review that and make sure that none of them are offensive or would violate any of the board policies. And we would, in the language that we give to donors, let them know that the board has discretion to remove any bricks that it deems aren't in line with its policies or aren't in line with the expectations in policy KQ. And the sponsorship review committee would review the plan and recommend to the board yes or no. And then the board would say, yes, we can enter into an agreement with the SAO for them to run this project and to donate these funds in this way. But if more language is needed in here to make that clear, we can look into that.
I definitely share Ms. Russell's concern that this maybe gets a little granular, that we're really looking at very small donations, and then where do you put a stop to that? Is a hippo, tiger, giraffe ticket a donation? Do you look at every individual who has purchased a hippo, tiger, giraffe ticket for $10 and every family who's bought a raffle ticket? I mean, it's just like, what are the implications of this? And I understand with the bricks, that's putting language on a piece of property, and I can see the need. And I think that we have a brick, I think that there was information saying we will look at what you wrote to make sure it's okay. But yeah, I don't know then where we make the cut, and I did have Ms. Russell's interpretation that sponsorship or partnership was more of a lump sum, larger gift or partnership that's being entered into than small individual donations.
I would agree with that as well. I think when you're talking in that kind of term, it's more sponsorship, partnership. It's someone giving 10, 15, 20 versus that would take a heck of a lot of time for our already overworked staff to kind of go through each person that buys a brick to do that. Other than just, like you just said, making sure what they're putting on the brick isn't offensive, but doing that deeper dive, I think that's a whole heck
for
of a lot
political
there.
campaigns, anything under $100 is not reported. So I don't know if we have a similar threshold where anything under X amount of dollars is not, we don't, if the PTA is raising $20 a piece from people, that's not something we go into. Yeah.
And I guess it just seems to me that when you're talking about vetting the bricks themselves and what's going to be put on a physical building, that's more about the brick and the building as opposed to the person who's buying it. And so I think this policy is about the people who are supporting or sponsoring, not what they're putting in place, because obviously we have jurisdiction over that, and that's pretty clear in our policy, so.
So, thank you for having the same conversation we had with the SAOs this morning. It truly is, we got down to the hippo, tiger, giraffe games and sort of talking about that and the bricks and pizza. And I think we have some work to do to try to delineate and distinguish between and among different types of, and I said it this morning, we have some work to do to try to sort through this. And so this is not an easy policy to try to get our head around because there are implications down the line. And so if we get the big pieces right, like the morals clause and some of these others, we can begin to sort of split and distinguish within the policy or within a reg. You know, that's the other piece of it too, is there'll be a back-ended reg to this. So in an effort to try to move us on, if that's okay with you, Madam Chair, the last piece was around the named sponsorships and the naming of specific areas of school facilities, and that's on page 5, line 12.
And that's precisely what you were saying, Ms. Russell, that it feels different if it's an actual physical name on a building. And so this language was taken from former policy 4.4, saying that name sponsorship and naming specific areas means if there's going to be the name of a group or individual or entity on display in public schools of a name, word, or phrase, or on a plaque or comparable medium. So that's recognizing that it's different than just a monetary donation that goes towards the schools. It's something that exists in perpetuity up until that's changed.
So I appreciate Dr. Noonan's effort to move us on, but I'm not quite ready to do that yet.
Fair enough.
So I have some specific language proposals for 3 different unconnected things.
Okay.
The first is on Dr. Noonan's language before about proposal that we sort of leave the language as it is for the actual standing up of the committee, whether whether it's a may or not, and whether they're one-year terms. I would agree with his approach and suggest we leave the language as it is because we are building a new high school, and that we ought to set the committee up and set it forward and treat it as if it's going to be a permanent thing, but then allow our experience after 1 year to decide whether we reappoint or not. So we would have a non-ad hoc, we would have a standing committee to start, and then we'll see where our experience takes us. And I think the current language allows that. If it doesn't, I'd be happy to have any adjustments. The second thing is, as we were talking about Ms. Russell's last point, it occurs to me that there's an inconsistency, which I hadn't noticed before on page 2, between the first and second paragraph of authority to enter into agreements that may help with this.
Okay.
The principal actually has the authority to enter into sponsorships that does not extend beyond a single school year and does not exceed $2,500 in cumulative value from a single sponsor partner to the school. That same language does not appear in the second paragraph for the superintendent's authority, and perhaps if it does, we solve a lot of these problems. If we said extends beyond one or more a single school years and does not exceed $20,000 in value as in cumulative value from a single sponsor partner to the school, which would exclude the lots of people giving $50. The thing I'm most concerned about is I'm thinking about, my kid going around and doing band fundraising and raking and how that's across the entire band. I'm sure that's more than $20,000, and I don't think we want to be involved in that. The last thing is I did have a proposal to substitute for clause 3 in the morals clause, which is strike what it says and stay instead, because it's, if you do A, B, or C, you can get kicked out. Acted in a way inconsistent with the mission, policies, and practices of Falls Church City Public Schools.
And that would still be a publication of a credible allegation that the partner acted in a way inconsistent with the mission, vision, and policies.
Right. I wasn't trying to deal with
Yeah,
the vice chair's concerns about allegation.
got it.
I like it though.
Comments? Mr. Anderson?
So, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in agreement with the last comment that Mr. Redding was just making, and also on the idea of standing sponsorship review committee. I have a concern about the language about the $20,000 cumulative value. From a single sponsor or partner to the school, the question is, with whom are we making the agreement, right? To pick the example of going out and raking as part of tag day and band fundraising, is the agreement with the band boosters, or is the agreement with an individual person who's part of the band boosters? If it's with the band boosters, then that $20,000 in value could easily be exceeded, and then this would trip, right? So that's the thing. We're going to have to figure out the language on what would constitute the partnership. group that we're partnering with in order to make that work. But in principle, if we can figure that out, I'm fine with the rest of it, so.
One piece that might fix that, and that we did talk with the SAs about today, is policy 4.4 specifically says you have to bring a proposal before the school board, or you have to include this advertising or sponsorship in your annual status renewal. So that might cover the tag day funding, if it's included in their annual renewal as an SAO, that this is what they're planning on doing, and the board reviews it. It would take it out of the pot of information that the superintendent is reviewing.
I think we got to figure that out.
Okay.
I think that's our work, is to, I think there are some things that you guys don't want to have any part of, and I don't blame you. It makes perfect sense. Selling tickets to a show, that's going to exceed a certain amount, selling tickets to, or tag day or whatever. And I think we've got to figure out how to write that in a way that makes sense from an operational and a governance perspective.
I guess just one last comment on that, with regard to the review, I guess, having it embedded in their annual report or their end of the year. Personally, I'd prefer to have it be, more formal than that, and not something that's just kind of thrown into a report and that we have to, I don't know, I just think that there's greater chance, and especially if it's a $20,000 item, that we want to have that brought to our attention and not just embedded in a report. So.
Yes, Mr. Redinger.
Just with regard to the future drafting work, an alternative to consider is, because there is so much ambiguity in the language, to just have a safe harbor or carve out that says this policy shall not apply to things like ticket sales and student fundraising efforts for trips or whatever, and cover the things that you really don't want to get involved in. And I don't know if that's better or not, but it is an option.
Something we talked about this morning.
Yes, Mr. Castillo.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe we should, it seems to me one of the problems with this policy is we're trying to engineer it to perfection. So maybe you sunset it after a year and you revisit it. I think you want to stand up a policy so that people who want to donate know that there's a policy so they can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we try and make some mistakes. And so we do, usually we revisit these policies on a what, a
5-year
multi-year.
basis, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we try something, we do the best we can,
Mm-hmm.
and we say, after a year, we'll take a look at it because we're learning.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments for right now? Seeing none, it was a great discussion, and thank you very much for all of your hard work, Ms. Minson and Dr. Noonan, and we look forward to discussing it again. So we don't look forward to it. We will discuss it again. Thank you so much for your work. Let's move on to section 2.03, the FY28 budget update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will do a brief presentation, just sort of reviewing and updating the board on the school board's approved budget. And I want to thank Wyatt Shields, who's in the audience this evening. The city manager last night was successful in shepherding through the city of Falls Church's annual budget, which included the school board's budget, and it was adopted 7-0 last night by the council. So we are in a very good position from a perspective of the schools. So with that, I wanted just to start with just a reminder around what our budget approach was as we headed into this year's season. And really our highest priority, and I think the city manager reflected on this last night as well, is really on people. We really are a people-driven organization. 86% of our money goes to people within the school's budget, and they are the lifeblood of our organization. And we really believed as we headed into this year's budget that they needed to be our budget priority, and looking at compensation. Additionally, because of the new high school that's coming online and the approach with the capital plan, we really felt like we wanted to try to work as best we could within budget guidance this year, and we've been able to successfully do that. We've been able to do it through some reductions and some realignments that we've been able to make this year, which has allowed us to provide those employee compensation increases within the organic revenue growth from the city. And then all of that being cognizant of the fact that our student enrollment is projected to be 2,669 students next year. So it's a small growth, but it is growth nonetheless. And we had some opportunities this year that we might not otherwise have. So again, 2020 projected revenue and expenditures. This again, sort of on the revenue side, 82.6% of our revenue does come from the local transfer. And again, we thank the City Council and general government for their work. About 14% comes from the state, 1% from federal, about 1.9 comes from fee and others, and then we have a small beginning balance that we begin with each year. Just like in your home budget, we always like to keep a little bit of money in a beginning balance that allows us to maintain some flexibility. And then with respect to expenditures, kind of going back to the earlier comments, 85% of our budget is in salaries and benefits, and then 13.4 is in logistics, and then 1.3% is in transfers. Again, these are slides that you've seen previously, so I won't linger on them too much. Our request this year for the budget was for a 2% revenue increase, which was $844,231, and to share any additional funding or revenue that came in following the December's projections at a 50-50 percentage. And for FY 2020, that projection came in at an additional $200,000 to the schools. So the revenue for 2020 doesn't meet the cost of providing basic compensation increases. I think everybody kind of knew that going in, that we were going to have to do some things on the backside to make it balance. And we were able to do that through some, again, reductions, realignments, and some one-time opportunities. These realignments and reductions, just for the good of the board and for the community that's listening at home, are not going to be available in 2021. We really took it down as far as we could in terms of belt tightening with respect to class size and the like, making sure that we're as close as we possibly can without exceeding what the guidance of the school board is. And again, we wanted to thank the City Council for their partnership and support of this budget request. With respect to compensation, again, we are providing a step for all eligible employees. That step is about 2.95% on average for all of our eligible employees. We also looked at a 1% increase in the cost of living adjustment, and that was to remain competitive with the surrounding school systems. As I've indicated before, if we just do a step, our salary scale doesn't grow, so it's important to try to do both, a step and a COLA, so that our cost of living adjustment does increase as well. Also, we looked at substitute pay, increasing it by $2 an hour for our short and long-term substitutes. And we are, like other school divisions in the Northern Virginia region, really facing some substitute shortages. So we're hoping that this compensation adjustment will help attract. We also have some strategies that we're trying to deploy to bring in some more substitutes as well. We did see some healthcare insurance rate changes, and in this presentation, we've recognized those. So, for example, we saw an increase in Kaiser at an 8.9% increase, and then there was an overall reduction in our Key Advantage, which is the Blue Cross Blue Shield product, of 2.7%. And we had calculated about a 10% increase overall for healthcare, so we actually were able to realize a little bit in that differential there. Again, for everyone, that increase applies to both the employer and the employee rate. So our employees will feel the adjustment if they have adopted Kaiser. Our employee assistance program, we are really excited about joining the general government this year to engage with the Northern Virginia Employee Assistance Consortium, who offers a really nice, robust, and low-cost employee assistance program. And it's more than just supporting through mental health services. They also offer financial planning assistance and services. And they also, I found out provide assistance to plan travel as well. So they're really a full-service organization, and that's a really great opportunity for us to join with the general government. The reductions in realignments, again, this is where we were able to find some savings this year. First is in salary turnover, $185,000. Our post-employment benefits, $71,000, and our transitional retirement in the $44,000 range. And then we get into the bigger position realignments, where we were hoping to realize about $465,000 in savings, and all of this was within the ability to maintain the planning factors. We have realigned 4.5 positions. Our goal was to realign 5. And so we've been able to identify $419,476 in savings through those realignments. It's 3.8 teachers, a half a para, and a 0.2 of a support position. And we've been able to offset the difference through some other means that we'll show you here at the end. The logistics reduction that we were able to take is $100,000, and that comes from the relocation of our central office. And then we are anticipating that after it's all said and done, that we'll have about $225,000 remaining. And we are recommending that we put that in a staffing reserve. And the reason that we'd like to put that in the staffing reserve is because we did make so many reductions in employees, again, 4.5 positions, not in the abstract. It was done through some significant calculus looking at projections, but there are some numbers that are a little soft. For example, we don't really know what our kindergarten number is going to be. We have a pretty good projection of what that number is going to be, but if our kindergarten projection is off and we did need to add a position, this position reserve would provide us the flexibility and opportunity to add that position back should we need it. So the reserve represents a fund that's equivalent to about 2.5 positions. That includes salary and benefits. If this money isn't needed and we recognize that we have this savings, we will be able to repurpose this with the guidance of the school board moving forward next year. So the adjustments to the advertised budget, here is the general government transfer. Whoops. We again got a $200,000 increase from the government transfer. We weren't able to realize state aid as much as we thought we were going to, so we were down about $37,385. With respect to expenditures, again, we saved about $100,000 in what we projected were going to be our health costs increases. So we projected $400,000. That's the right number, right? $300,000. We only ended up needing $200,000, so we were able to realize $100,000 that we had projected. The Employee Assistance Program is saving us almost $9,000 or about $8,500 a year through those position reduction savings, and then staffing reserve. Our expenditure total is $162,614, which leaves us an ending balance of 0, which is where we want to be. So again, this is the approved budget summary that we've shown before. We have made all the adjustments on the left-hand side, which are the revenue increases, all the adjustments on the expenditure side. And this, as you may recall, both sides were off by $1. Now they're right aligned. We're excited about that. And what ends up as our overall approved transfer from the City Council based on the budget that they adopted last night is a 2.4% increase over last year's budget. So with that, we have a couple of budget questions that we wanted to go through with you tonight. But before we do that, any questions, Madam Chair?
Any questions?
All right. So Ms. Michael has some budget questions that she'd like to talk through.
So first, thank you so much to Michelle Kopic, who's here this evening, for all of her great work. The new budget question responses that we're posting this evening. Thank you. The first two are questions that we appreciate our partners in the general government completing on our behalf, were questions 17 and 18, which had to do with the real estate median tax bill for city homeowners over the past 10 to 20 years in both nominal and adjusted dollars. And then question 18, I'm going to flip to it and I'll come right back, was also related to the same thing in terms of looking at a year-by-year per resident amount in the city general fund, the CIP, and the transfer to the schools. So included on question number 17 is that chart that provides each of those values for the school board. Then the other question that we answered is a question that was asked a long time ago by Mr. Rettinger. If you remember this question from a long time ago, it was when we first started the budget process and we provided the 5 years of financial data. The question had come back saying it would be more helpful if we could get, most recently, the FY18 budget, the 18 actuals, then what was the 19 budget, our actuals to date, what we projected for the year, and then how does that compare to our 2020 proposed budget. So we created a chart that online is really little, but it looks much better on the screen. So I know right here it's small, but online you can zoom to see it. So what we actually did is we went back to FY17 thinking having just one more year of data may really help. So the way we presented this information is it's sorted first by revenue, then by expenditures. They're in order by object, and just for the people listening, object is the what. So the what we're getting the money for, or the what we're spending the money on. So you can see on this top first line, what it shows us is the what is our school bus stop violations. So that's the stop arm camera revenue on our buses. So as you're working across, what you're gonna see is you'll see our FY17 budget. What was the actual revenue we received in FY17? What was that variance? So in FY17, you can see we budgeted $154,800, I think, in terms of our stop arm camera revenue. And what we actually received was substantially smaller, $5,500. So our variance between our budget and actual was our actuals were $149,300 below our budget, right? So in terms of a budget variance, that was, negative 96.4% for that year. So then if you move across, you'll see in the same data for FY18. You can see in 18, our budget was still at that same $154,800 level, but our actual revenue came in higher at $81,775. We still had that variance of $73,025. So we were, 0.47 or 47.2% below. And then you'll see for FY19, what we've given you is the budget. What was our actual through month 9, which is our actuals through March, right? What do we project to get for the year? Then that variance is the projected budget, projected actual variance. So when we think of stop arm cameras, our budget for FY19 was actually reduced based on previous trends to $45,000. Through March, we've received $118,100. We project that for the year, we'll end up collecting $181,500. So our variance in this case is positive. We're projecting $136,500 more dollars. So our variance then is we would have collected 303% of what we budgeted. And then you can see for FY20, we've budgeted $55,000. Stop arm cameras in this case is a good example because there's some significant volatility, I would say, in that line item. So the first page gives you revenue, and then the exact same thing repeats on all of the following pages for expenditures, right, starting with our school board member salaries. So we hope that this view will be super helpful. To get this report, we had to run 2 different kind of sets. Our actual financial system gives us the previous data, but to start to add in the budget for the next year, we had to use the budget module. So this was a little bit harder to put together, but we really hope that it's helpful. It was certainly helpful to staff, so hopefully it'll be helpful to the school board and public as well.
Any questions or comments?
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Castillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what did we learn from this chart? What does it tell us?
So I think it tells us a couple of things, right? I think there are some categories that are very difficult to project, right? When I think of things like stop arm cameras, right, it's really hard when you look at this volatility to see how come, right? I would say it was because our program had been suspended pending some outcomes of some litigation, right? That program is back in full force, so our revenue is up, right? It doesn't yet show us that, we now this year have gotten a lot of stop arm camera violations. Our hope is that that's really going to decrease people passing buses that are stopped, right? In which case that revenue should decrease. So I would say for items like this, that's not particularly helpful. But when we're starting to think about trend data, whether it's when we think of revenue, sales tax, or our largest category in terms of instructional wages, I think this really does show you, for instructional wages, it's probably about the 6th line down. You can see that we have consistently underspent. We underspent in 2017 by 2.7%, then it was up to about 4% in FY18, but we're projecting that that's going to drop way down when we get to FY19. So my hope is that it's really helpful in terms of where do we see predictability that we can use to help us budget better, and then where do we have greater volatility that we need to explain better.
Yeah, but I guess, for example, with respect to Dr. Noonan's cost transformation, some of those instructional wages, that those trends could be showing that you're running out of some excess, as seniority drops, maybe the volatility will go away simply by virtue of the fact there are not as many senior people. So I guess there may be some deeper trends in there behind the numbers that are worth teasing out. I don't know one way or the other.
Sure, and I would say there are deeper trends that we need to look behind each of these things, right? When you think of a budget and actual, I always say your budget is your plan and your actual is what happened, right? We don't want to get in a situation where we're processing a ton of budget transfers to try to get our actuals to align with budget, because then the budget isn't a helpful tool to help us plan and think better. And then certainly as we move forward and start to make changes and adopt different practices, that's going to impact these trends. So for example, for the first time in FY 2020, we're actually budgeting to have savings from employee turnover, right, which we haven't done in the past, right? And the real goal is we want to make sure that we're spending the money the best way we can with the most planning up front, right? At the end of the year, we want to end the year with having a positive balance or having not expended all of the revenue that we've received. But we don't want that variance to be too large, because then it means we didn't fully use all the money that we could have in the beginning to meet the board and the school system's priorities, right? We waited till the end and then we made decisions with a different set of data. So I think all of this to me is that the budget is really a planning tool, and it really helps us plan and think better. And hopefully having the data will improve the conversations that we're having and really thinking strategically about how we're using the resources we have.
Although ultimately, the biggest single budget busting factor you can't plan for, right?
That is entirely true.
Any other? Yes, Mr. Reidinger.
So to further answer Mr. Castillo's question, along the line, as Ms. Michael said, the thing that I like to use this sort of chart for is whether there's a persistent overspend or underspend in a category. And it can tell you if your budgeting is accurate or not, as you suggested. What I'm going to be really interested in seeing this for next year is, does the reduction we took from staff turnover reduce or more accurately reflect our budget numbers on human capital costs? And iteratively, we can see, what the right number is, and making sure that the budget, as you're suggesting, Ms. Michael, better reflects the place that the actual expenditures will be. I haven't spent enough time with the chart already. There are some fairly, interesting places. Like I noted that, private school tuition was really underspent the last couple of years, but 2 years ago, we way overspent. So, that immediately tells me, rightly or wrongly, that there's some unpredictability there. You don't know what's going to come up for the year in terms of what the services are needed based on the students. And that you can't explain. But for things like human capital costs, it can be pretty useful. So I hope it is as useful to the school personnel going forward as I expect it to be to people like me who, in looking at the budget, like to look at line items and making sure that we're putting money in the right places.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And picking up on the last thread from Mr. Reidinger's comment, is it possible to have the spreadsheet itself posted online? Because then one can dive into those lines as much as you want to, I suppose. That'd be very helpful. I thank you, because I think this is really going to be useful information.
So the other item related to this that's posted is our monthly financial report through month 9. So those numbers match this, and our revenue expenditures are trending as we would have expected.
Great, thank you so much, Ms. Michaels and Ms. Kopic, for all of your hard work. We will move on to 2.05, our GMP1 review.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to actually invite some of my friends up to the table who have been waiting so patiently this evening. I want to welcome Daisy Brangman, William Devan, and Jeff Bonvecchio. I don't know if all of you are going to join us or not, but this evening, this conversation is in really 2 parts. The first part is sort of a public presentation about the GMP and what to expect in GMP 1. And following this work session item, we'll go into closed, where we'll talk more in detail about the finances of GMP1, and at that point, we also will talk about a couple other things. So with that, I've asked Ms. Brangman to kind of give us a sort of a high-flying overview, if you will, about GMP1, and I'll turn it over to her.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. So right now, we are currently in the midst of a couple of concurrent activities. We're in the midst of reviewing the DD submission set and reconciling that, reviewing the DD estimate, reconciling that with our independent estimate, trying to get it to, working with the design builder to align that to our project budget along with our overall DD estimate. And then while we're reviewing the GMP, this is the opportunity to review comprehensive agreement, the associated agreement amendment, and working to get that. I believe at a previous school board meeting, we walked through what's included in GMP number 1, and I'll quickly run through that. So the purpose of GMP number 1 is really to get us through what's approximately the first 6 months of construction. It allows us to put a shovel in the ground, do excavation, foundations, concrete. It allows us to order all those long lead items in order to start building the building come October through January. So steel, mechanical, electrical, plumbing equipment, a lot of which actually goes under and in the foundation system. Elevators have a very long lead item, and they will not start design until they have a contract in place. So it's really securing both the cost and getting the best value for the city, as well as securing the contractors, because it is a very competitive contracting market. So to quickly run through, the packages that are included are concrete, structural steel, roof anchors, elevators, fire suppression, mechanical, electrical, plumbing equipment, geothermal, foundations, earthworks, site utilities, and then the miscellaneous permit fees, bond, general contractor fee, and that's what's currently included in the in Gilbane's proposed GMP, which we're still reviewing. And then moving forward, just a quick schedule summary. So we received the GMP on April 12th. Not myself, but the rest of the team, who was very kind to cover for me while I was on vacation, have been reviewing it, and I've jumped in since yesterday. So we're in the process of reviewing in depth the GMP that was submitted, working with both Tricia and William Devan on the any modifications to the comprehensive agreement, which are really more high-level cleanup of the scope of work of the project, things like removing demolition of the high school, which is no longer in Gilbane's scope of work. Moving ahead, just looking at the GMP, we plan to come back to you on May 7th to respond and follow up on any questions that you may have. We'll continue to work with Gilbane to iron out details in the GMB as well as the amendment and the comprehensive agreement, all with the goal of being able to execute the GMP by May 15th. And the key to that date is it allows us to keep the December 2020 completion of the building, which allows us to do a very expedited but feasible winter move-in between December and January of that school year. Not meeting that date does have impacts and implications on that schedule.
All right, any questions before we move it, where we will, of course, go into a closed session and talk about all this in more detail? No? All right. Thank you very much. Seeing none, we will move into our closed meeting. Would someone please read us into closed?
Pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, I move that the board convene a closed meeting for the following purpose: to discuss the award of a public contract involving the expenditure of public funds, including interviews of bidders or offerers and discussion of the terms or scope of such contract, where discussion in open session would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A 29, in particular, a GMP1 review.
Thank you, Ms. Russell. Do you have a second? Second. Thank you, Ms. Liddon.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mr. Castillo? Ms. Gill?
Aye.
Ms. Litton? Mr. Reitinger? Ms. Russell?
Yes.
And Mr. Webb?
Yes.
Thank you.